Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm Carrie Enright-Cato, Director of the Office of Climate Change, Technology, and Research at Connecticut DEEP. Welcome to the Exploring Climate Solutions webinar series. This series is brought to you by the Governor's Council on Climate Change. This past Thursday, Governor Malloy issued an executive order creating the Governor's Council on Climate Change, also known as the GC3. The Council is charged with examining the efficacy of existing policies and regulations designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and identify new strategies to meet the state's greenhouse gas reduction targets. The Council is composed of 15 members from state agencies, quasi-state agencies, businesses, and nonprofits. To learn more about the GC3, please go to www.ct.gov/DEEP/GC3. As a part of the Council's exploratory process, this webinar series explores innovative and successful climate change solutions in Connecticut and across the country. The series will provide first-hand accounts of high-profile municipal climate programs, climate initiatives in the corporate world, greenhouse gas reporting frameworks, statewide sustainability programs, and low-carbon fuel initiatives. Today, we're excited to have as our presenter Elizabeth Sawin, co-director of Climate Interactive, and project specialist Stephanie McCauley. While Elizabeth will be leading the presentation on multi-solving, Stephanie, who has assisted in the research, will contribute to responding to questions. Multi-solving is a search for systemic solutions that protect the climate while improving health, equity, and well-being. While most people find the idea of addressing climate change in ways that capture co-benefits intuitively appealing, there are often practical obstacles to doing so. Today, we'll learn about the potential for capturing co-benefits in various aspects of climate and energy policy and opportunities to reduce the barriers that often stand in the way. Their presentation will be about 40 minutes long, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. If you have a question, please submit your question in the question box, and we will read it aloud for our guests to respond to. Before we get started, for those of you listening via your computer speakers and are experiencing poor sound quality, I encourage you to call in using your telephone. So with that, Elizabeth, thank you again for your willingness to share your research and findings with us, and then I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to begin.
Great. Thanks very much for your introduction, Carrie. I'm really happy to be here and excited to talk about multi-solving. I've been working on climate change and sustainability for almost 20 years, and I would easily say that multi-solving and the idea of multiple benefits is the most exciting, hopeful, producing kind of field of research that I've encountered. So I'm excited to share it, and then in the question and answer session to maybe learn more about what's going on in Connecticut. So a little bit about Climate Interactive to start off. Carrie, I'm finding the slide is not advancing, even though it did in the dry run. Any advice for me?
We've never had this technical issue before. Go ahead and try to reload your presentation using the sharing screen mechanism.
There, I think I got it. Can you just tell me, do you see it?
Yep, it's working.
Great, okay. So a few words about Climate Interactive and about myself. So Climate Interactive is a think, do tank. We're 10 people. We focus on helping people see what works to address our biggest climate challenges, and we focus particularly on clean energy, food and water issues related to climate change, and climate resilience. And the methodologies that we use all center around analysis of systems. Often we use computer simulation to help people find points of leverage to meet climate goals or other goals. We also use systems mapping, and our work tends to be very interactive with groups of stakeholders and people learning from each other. One of the projects related to climate and simulation that we've been involved in now since 2008, there's just an important recognition of the many supporters and partners who've helped with this multi-solving work. So one of our projects traces back to at least 2008. It's called the Climate Scoreboard, and it's not a multi-solving project per se, but it is really the impetus behind why Climate Interactive now is devoting some of its focus to multi-solving. So I wanted to start here with just a few words. It's also, if you've encountered us in Climate Interactive, it's most likely via the Climate Scoreboard, which is really what we're most well known for. The Climate Scoreboard tracks the pledges that countries make in the UN climate negotiations. So last month, December 2015, probably most of you know, was a big moment for global climate policy. And Climate Interactive was very involved in that in the run-up to it and during the negotiations themselves, adding up the pledges on the table and reflecting back to the world what those pledges meant for the long-term global climate. And we were really pleased as such a small group to have big news outlets like the New York Times sharing our results with people. But what we found actually has a lot of bearing on the idea of multi-solving. So this is some data from one of our simulations. And if you go to the Climate Interactive website, you can find more of the science behind this on the section on the Climate Scoreboard. But this is looking at global greenhouse gas emissions over the next century under 4 different scenarios. So the first one in blue is the scenario where the world does nothing to respond to climate change. You can see a really dangerous 4.5 degrees centigrade, 8 degrees Fahrenheit temperature increase. The red line, this is the outcome of the Paris negotiations. INDCs is the language of those negotiations to talk to about the pledges. So if all the countries do what they promised in Paris, there's a big improvement over doing nothing, something like 3.5 degrees temperature increase. But likely you all know that climate scientists tell us this is a really unsafe range to be in, and that really the safe path for humanity is down here somewhere below 2 degrees. So we look at 2 pathways for emissions that could deliver that kind of stable, much safer climate, although certainly not a climate without challenges. The important thing about the Paris Agreement, one important thing beyond this improvement over business as usual, is that the agreement also builds in this process for periodic reconvening of all the governments with the idea of more and more ambitious action. They're now set for a kind of 5-year timetable of pledges and reviews of previous pledges and increasing ambition. And I wanted to give you this sense of global context because I understand that part of the work of the Connecticut Governor's Council on Climate Change is related to that kind of long-term view and what's the pathway forward toward the 2050 target that Connecticut's put forth, a really ambitious target of 80% reductions below 2001 is my understanding. So to put that in this global context, this path that the rest of the world needs to be on in order to keep temperatures below 2 degrees, temperature increase below 2 degrees centigrade is really similar to the path that Connecticut has laid out for itself. And so there's this interesting process that now needs to happen to talk about where do we go from here. And that has businesses and governments, both national and subnational governments and cities all over the world, talking about what are their next climate targets. And in any process like that, there's a tension between what seems possible, which is likely at the higher end of a range, and what seems necessary, which is at a lower end of the range. And that's where multi-solving comes in, because we see a lot of evidence that this approach towards thinking about co-benefits is really a very promising strategy for bringing what's possible much closer to what's necessary. In other words, to expanding people's sense in terms of our political realities and our fiscal realities, expanding people's sense of what's possible so that what's possible comes much closer to what's necessary. This is a schematic that hopefully makes what I just said clear in a more descriptive sort of way. So we can think about the benefits that come out of policies to address climate change on 2 different axes. One is, when will we see the benefit? Is it going to be fairly immediate? That would be down here toward the left. Or is it way out toward the end of the century or beyond? And that would be out toward the right. And then where do we expect the benefit? Is that going to be in our own communities, or is that going to be benefit, you know, for the whole planet? When we talk about climate change, it's global climate change. So you could think about these kind of 2 spheres. There's this corner down here. These are the needs people feel most urgently in their communities. This is the local and immediate. And then there's the irreversible future threats that tend to be global and they tend to be far out. And as you know, when it comes to climate change, we have to act to address those now because of the long delays between changing our energy system and seeing changes in the global climate. It could be a really challenging situation if these two sets of needs were really viewed as being in conflict. And often in the past, I'd say they have been. We tend to have different specialists, different disciplines who focus on the global climate and the energy systems, and people who focus on things like healthcare or well-being or urban planning. What the emerging field of multiple benefits is saying, this framing that I think is picking up traction around the world, is that these things don't necessarily need to be in such conflict. And if we design for multiple benefits, there's a potential to find a whole bunch of investments and policies and options that are bringing benefit on both of these with the same investment. So here's some examples of those long-term global benefits, preventing things like sea level rise, extreme weather events, high CO2 levels, temperature increases. Here's some of the potential more local, more immediate benefits: jobs from a new clean economy, fuel savings from getting off of fossil fuels, air quality, health benefits, lots of benefits for obesity and chronic disease that come along with good urban planning, for example. And the really interesting thing about these more local and immediate benefits is that they aren't one-time benefits. Once we build for them, we actually continue to reap the benefits of a lot of those investments. So they become actually local long-term benefits. I think that's really important to think about for anyone faced with setting near-term or intermediate climate targets, because the sooner you set ambitious targets, the longer into the future you're set yourself up to reap these repetitive year after year annual benefits like fuel savings or reduced healthcare costs. And you'll see in some of the data from studies I'm going to present in a minute some quantification of that potential. So multi-solving, as Carrie said at the beginning, we define at Climate Interactive as the search for systemic solutions that protect the climate while improving health, equity, and well-being. We think there's 4 particularly important reasons that this is really important. One is an ethical reason. People in our country and in our world are suffering today from things like poverty, violence, and poor health and inequity. And even while we're very concerned about long-term global climate change, there's an ethical responsibility to address that present-day suffering. Multi-solving says we don't have to put those two needs, pit them against each other. We can actually, if we design things well, address both of them at once. Then there's a very pragmatic reason. If anytime you can solve two problems with the same investment, that's just good, prudent fiscal management. There's also a political or social reason. Anytime that you can, with one investment or one policy, meet the needs of more than one constituency, you've just increased the power, political, social power at your fingertips to address the vested interests that we know are holding our current fossil fuel intensive economy in place. So it just makes sense to look for those allegiances. And then from my field of systems analysis, it's just a well-known principle that healthier systems tend to be oriented toward multiple goals, and that if you design with a really narrow focus on only a single goal, such as reducing carbon emissions, you can sometimes get perverse system behavior or poor overall system level performance. So often it's just good systems design to look for the sweet spot where you are solving for many important variables at once. It seems pretty clear to me from what I've read about work going on in Connecticut that nothing I've said so far is going to sound very new in your state. This is about a month old now, I guess, from Governor Malloy talking about Connecticut signing on to something called the Under 2 MOU. And from being in Paris, I can tell you this was an exciting moment that got brought to the Paris negotiations, where cities and states around the world are talking about their commitment to help deliver global climate goals. But the important thing I want you to see here is in the second paragraph. So Connecticut has set an aggressive goal for reducing carbon emissions to combat climate change. and is determined to do so in a manner that improves our environment and air quality while increasing our energy security, building our economy, and creating jobs. So that's exactly what I'm talking about when I say that Climate Interactive is researching the opportunities for multi-solving. It's finding these opportunities. So what I hope to bring and share with you today isn't so much to convince you this is a good idea, because clearly Connecticut is heading in this direction anyway, but to say that what we're seeing in our research is that multi-solving doesn't just happen because you want it to. It actually takes a different type of planning process, a different type of investment and policy making process. And so I'd like to share some ideas about what those differences might be. And that's what this slide basically says, that I hope to seed your good work in Connecticut with some of what we're finding in other states and other places around the world. And certainly not to claim any kind of monopoly on this type of thinking at Climate Interactive. More, we're trying to synthesize a whole body of research that's been ongoing for decades and is just picking up steam in these last few years. So there's just a handful of reports from all sorts of universities and institutions like the World Bank and the United Nations Environment Program in the last few years that focus on multiple benefits of acting on climate and clean energy. So I want to show a few slides that are drawn from some of those reports I just showed you to give you a sense of how people are measuring and talking about the possible scale of co-benefits of good climate policy. This is a study that is focused on the European Union. It comes from a couple European health NGOs, and they looked at the cost of Europe making its previous climate pledge, so not the one that just got made in Paris, but the prior round centered around Copenhagen, making that pledge more ambitious. It was a 20% reduction. This study modeled, well, what if Europe went to a deeper reduction, 30%? They said there'd be an additional 45 billion euros in costs to get that additional carbon benefit. And that's a cumulative cost from I think it was 2013 or 2012 through 2020. Then the study tried to look at the economic value of the savings to the health system in the EU. And you can see over here all the different types of benefits they were counting. So less hospitalizations, less days of respiratory illness, and fewer premature deaths. And they, because this is not an exact science, they had a range of parameters that gave them a low estimate of benefit and a high estimate of benefit. But here's the really interesting thing is these are annual benefits. So here we're looking at cumulative costs across that whole period, but then year after year, once that investment is in place, this would be the savings to the health system. So if you kind of pick the middle estimate here, it looks like it would be about 15 billion euros, 45 billion in outlay. And so you see that in a matter of 3 years, maybe 5 years down here at the lower estimate, in health savings, you're seeing the return on the cost that it took to get that better climate result. So I think in our personal lives, if anyone presented us with an investment with that kind of payback period, it would be really attractive. And so one interesting thing to us at Climate Interactive is with this really interesting, powerful payback, why aren't we seeing more aggressive climate action? Because, boy, it's looking like it has a lot of really valuable other benefits. And that's something I'll get to at the end of the talk, is what might be some of the barriers that makes this return that looks so obvious maybe hard to implement in our systems as they exist today. Here's another example. That first one was the European Union. This is a global study led by the World Bank. They looked at actually a bunch of different climate policies in a report called Climate Smart Development, which is from 2014, and you might find interesting. I'm just going to show you one, which is focused on transportation. So they looked at a bundle of different global transportation policies and investments. And the same sort of logic. They asked, how much would it cost, and what other benefits would we get back? So they estimated, again, a cumulative spending. This time it was between 2013 and 2030, a little bit more than $400 billion of cumulative global spending. But in that same period, there's a big savings, which is in reduced fuel costs, because there's much more efficient transportation in the scenarios with these investments. So in fact, there's just this gap, is the orange portion here between what governments would have to invest, and what wouldn't get paid back just in fuel savings. And then again, here's this idea of annual savings year after year once you make that investment. Here they're tracking fuel savings and the economic value of health and lives saved. And so again, you can compare the size of this light blue area with this orange area that's the gap, and you can see that once you've made that investment very quickly, year after year, you're reaping benefits that are the same order of what that initial investment cost you. So that same question, why aren't we already doing this, really came to mind for me and the research team who was comparing all these studies. And so I'm just showing you two, but I picked them as being kind of representative of what we saw in our literature review, that again and again across these different sectors, it seemed like there's just a really significant economic value from the multiple benefits of climate action that leaves us scratching our heads a little bit about why we aren't seeing the world acting, you know, even more aggressively to address climate change. So the graphs tell an important story, but there's also a human story that I think is important to keep in mind when thinking about multi-solving. I'm going to go past this example just to save time, but I think the slides will be available, and this is one at the city scale. So here's an example from an experiment, a pilot project in Great Britain. And the fascinating thing here is that the expenditures came from a public health budget. It was focused on individuals living in substandard housing who were coping with respiratory illness. And instead of treating this as a medical problem, the public health system invested in home weatherization, so insulation, better windows, and boilers for a number of families. And then they measured the results, and they saw things like higher temperatures in the homes, not surprising, lower spending on energy bills, again, not surprising, but really significant because these were often elderly people living on fixed incomes. And the public health savings they quantified in terms of significantly fewer emergency room visits and visits to doctor's offices. So that, to me, is a classic example of multi-solving, even to the point of reaching over into the public health budget and saying we could get a climate win and a health win if we do this investment in a smart way. And I also like this example because it's now brought down to a practical enough scale where you can see it benefiting, you know, real people in real communities. In this country, I think California is leading the way to show, again, the impact on real people in real communities. And this has really been assisted by the way that California has designed its cap and trade policy so that some of the revenue from that program is, my understanding is according to the legislation, it's mandated to be reinvested, particularly in marginalized communities or communities that have been disenfranchised. So here's this one example, which is a fleet modernization program. So it takes dirty, polluting vehicles off the road and helps families afford cleaner vehicles. And they've built into this program things like health screening and flu vaccinations and home weatherization, all as part of the same program. And lots of other research has really emphasized the importance of access to reliable transportation for families to move out of poverty in terms of access to jobs and schools and health care. So you can start to see in a very systems thinking type of way these sort of branching tentacled processes that give a climate benefit but then reach out to touch people's lives in lots of other ways. This is a report, if you haven't seen it, I thought was really fascinating and well done by the Green Mining Institute in, I think they're based in San Francisco, and it's 10 different case studies of what was done in some of the first pilots under that legislation in California. So you'll find there a whole bunch of other ideas. It ranges from things like solar for low-income families, van pools for farm workers, tree planting, home weatherization, diverting waste out of landfills into bio digesters for electricity. So check that out. It's a really interesting report. So that's a taste of the sense of possibility. It's this idea of investing in climate and in people and in communities at the same time. But here's the other side of it, the but, is that not all climate policies or investments are created equal when it comes to the co-benefits. So I want to show you a couple examples of that and then talk about what are the opportunities to address this fact that you don't just get these co-benefits by wanting them, that you have to design for them. So here's one example that we came across in the medical journal, The Lancet, and it compared two different scenarios for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transport sector in the City of London. One scenario was more efficient engines and more electric vehicles. The other scenario was replacing car travel with walking and cycling. And here's the interesting thing, for people like me who focused on climate and sustainability for my career, I would have said those were, pretty equivalently effective ideas because their reduction in CO2 is definitely in the same range. But to someone from a public health background, they would say these two scenarios have really different implications. And that's because this one provides some health benefit in reducing air pollution. In fact, they thought it would prevent about 17 deaths per million people. But this active transport scenario gets people out of their vehicles and moving around, and so that's paying off via reducing obesity and chronic disease to the order of something like 530 fewer deaths per million people. So suddenly these don't look like two kind of equal scenarios. You might as well just pick one. If you have a voice of public health in the conversation, there's real advantages of one scenario over the other. And so one thing that this points to is that to find the multiple benefits, to find the multi-solving scenarios, we likely have to include more people than just climate and energy experts in the task of formulating our climate plans. And one thing that I thought was really impressive about the makeup of the Governor's Council on Climate Change in Connecticut is that it seems to have that diversity of perspectives. So it seems to me that there's one pillar of multi-solving already in place that seems great. Here's a second example. I was curious about the growth in jobs in the renewable energy sector in California and wondering to what extent marginalized groups or historically disenfranchised groups were benefiting from that. So I put together the numbers that I could find. I'd be curious if other people have looked at this in different ways. But here's what I found. So this is the percent of the population of California falling into these three different racial or ethnic groups. Then what percent of the workforce, that's the dark blue line, falls into those groups. And then what percent of the solar workforce falls into those groups. So if the boom in solar was benefiting all groups equally, then the gray lines and the dark blue lines ought to at least line up. And you're seeing that, at least the data I found, they're not. And we know California is a work in progress and they're addressing and incorporating this. But just here's a snapshot to sort of say, again, it doesn't just happen that your climate policy can address other inequities or other needs or deficits in communities and in societies. This says to me, as an outside observer, there must be other policy elements or other investments that have to get figured out to really bring that benefit fully along with the climate benefit. So two examples of why we think it's really important to pay attention to the question of what else besides paying attention to tons of carbon might you want to be thinking about, and how might you want to change the processes in your climate and energy planning. So the last two slides I have are a handful of working hypotheses, I'd say, from Climate Interactive about what contributes to multi-solving. This is an evolving field and definitely not the last word, but offered in a sense of food for thought, and in the question and answers, it would be great to hear if anybody thinks I've left something really important off this list. So here's the first thing I'd say: invite diverse perspectives and cultivate curiosity along with expertise. Traditional energy and climate thinking, I'd say, brought in climate scientists and energy experts and thought that that was who was needed to make that policy. The examples that we're seeing say that you need more points of view than that, and you need the experts that you do bring in to be curious about the other methodologies and languages that come from other disciplines. One thing we found as we were doing our literature review was to what extent each different discipline has its own way of even just measuring. You know, climate and carbon is measured in different ways in different studies, whether it's a public health study or an energy study. And putting those apples and oranges together was a pretty challenging part of the research that we did. So a first rule of thumb or a corollary, I'd say, is expect, if you're going to take a multi-solving approach, to go slow at first, to remember that there needs to be this step of learning and exploring the intersections, and that takes building trust and building relationships. And so you may not be racing to write your policy right away, but first you may be learning from whoever you assemble. And that means between the disciplines, but also between the diverse constituencies in your communities. Thinking especially about the potential to improve social justice and equity via our climate policy. To figure out how best to go about that, it seems obvious to say it, but I think it can't be repeated too many times. You need to make sure that you're inviting the people who are living that experience of whatever social injustice you're trying to address into your conversations about how climate and energy investments or policy could actually help with those problems. We also think that having frameworks that allow people to think about the multiple benefits together and visual frameworks that help them see those benefits together can help cultivate that type of curiosity. And that's why one tool we've developed, we call FLOWER, the Framework for Whole Systems Equity-Based Reflection, is something that we're offering. And you'll find worksheets and instructions for this on our website. But it's a visual graphing or drawing technique where we've taken 6 different co-benefits. They're each represented by one of these petals or groups of co-benefits, and the climate benefit in the center. And for any investment or policy you might be considering, you can make a flower diagram. If you think that the investment is going to benefit food or clean water, you color that petal in green. And if you think it's going to have a resilience benefit, and so on. And then you can compare flower diagrams between different policy alternatives. Also, just touching back to one slide ago and talking about equity and the distribution of benefit, the flower diagram gives you a way to bring that into the conversation so that if the benefits are accruing to people who are already very well off in your communities, we encourage you to shade the petal darker at the center. So an example of that might be a subsidy for rooftop solar that only can be accessed by homeowners. So you have to be wealthy enough to afford a home before you qualify for that particular program. So that would be shaded, you know, darker in the center. Another program, say a job training program for people who haven't graduated from high school, that would be a benefit directed at a marginalized group. And so there we have you shade the outer edge of the petal darker than the center. And then other benefits you might say are fairly evenly distributed. You just shade them evenly. So just give you an example of 2 different flower diagrams for 2 different types of investments so you can see how this works. Here's an example from a workshop we did. One is looking at walkability and bikeability in the transport sector versus promoting electric vehicles. So if we go through first the walkability example, jobs and assets could be directed at not highly skilled workers. So you're building, say, bike paths and maintaining bike paths and sidewalks. So there's jobs, health and well-being. We've talked about the obesity and chronic disease benefits of active transportation. This petal here on connection, we're really encouraging people to think about the benefits of building things like social cohesion and social capital. So walking through your neighborhood, you see shopkeepers and your neighbors. That has an effect on the neighborhood itself. Mobility, obviously we're making it easier for people to get around by investing in that walking and biking infrastructure. Resilience, that might take a little more thought, but what the groups who drew this diagram were thinking here is, remember in Hurricane Sandy, we saw lots of people who were stranded because there was no electricity, so gas pumps weren't working and cars were out of gas and people were stuck. In the aftermath of a power outage, if there's places for people to walk and connectivity through walking and biking, that gives you a certain transportation resilience. So that's what one flower diagram would look like. Here on the other side, we saw fewer benefits. So there's jobs benefits, but people were saying, well, likely this is going to more highly skilled workers at manufacturing facilities for electric vehicles, which might not be in our community. They might not even be in our state. There would be some air pollution benefits. There'd be some mobility benefits, but the mobility benefits are probably going to people who can afford an electric vehicle to start with. That might not be everyone in our community, and they'd be going to people who have driver's licenses and whose vision is good enough to drive. What we're aiming for with Flower is something where at a glance you can sort of see some trade-offs between different sets of multiple benefits. And at Climate Interactive, we're not saying, you know, one is better than the other. We're saying it can really help a community or a group of stakeholders to look at the whole picture with a simple tool like this. So another example that we think, another element that comes into successful multi-solving is to reframe success as the best mix of multiple factors rather than maximizing a single one. And so we would say steer clear of only focusing on tons of greenhouse gas. Don't forget tons of greenhouse gas, but also think about the other benefits. And this picture comes from a tool that we developed with partners in the city of Milwaukee who are looking at different stormwater infrastructure choices, and we came up with 10 co-benefits of various investment scenarios. And for each scenario, there was an underlying computer simulation that showed how the mix of benefits shifted. And again, not our job to say what's the right mix for any community. Our job is to present a way for people to think about the mix of benefits and talk about what's their vision of the future for their place and what mix of benefits is really most motivating for them. We think it's worthwhile to have at least a mental checklist, maybe a physical one, to make sure there's a policy element for each benefit you're interested in. So just for an example, for a renewable energy project, if you want to get the jobs benefit, you might really need to think about, do we need a local hiring provision or do we need a jobs training provision? It won't necessarily happen in the way you want without designing for it. If you think that the renewable energy project is going to bring you resilience, it's really worth asking, well, what else do we need to make sure that's true? And you might find you need some sort of electricity storage, because if your project is tied to the grid and the grid goes down, that's not going to be resilient without storage. If you think that there's a potential community building benefit, then you may need to think about what's the ownership structure that's going to lead to local ownership and community building as opposed to outside investors and flows of capital. One thing we're trying to do at Climate Interactive is build a library of some of the best policies to capture each of these benefits, but multi-solving is so site-specific and so dependent on local conditions that it's probably going to be some element of figuring that out for yourself, but at least remembering to check, you know, if these are the co-benefits we want, what are we actually designing in to make sure we get them? I think this is a really important one that we're seeing. Lots of times a barrier to multi-solving has to do with how budgets or authority is set up. So in a classic example, you may have to spend money from the energy or transportation budget to put in, say, cleaner transportation or cleaner electricity. You might see a lot of savings in the health budget in terms of fewer cases of respiratory illness. Overall, for the whole system, for the state, let's say, that could be a real win. But if you have set up so that people's promotion or re-election depends on their performance within just that, you know, narrow sphere that's their jurisdiction, it might be difficult to make the flows of capital happen in the ways that are needed. So it might be to unlock the potential for multi-solving needs a higher level view and potentially changing some of the incentives for evaluating performance within the subsystems of the overall system. We also see that many of the opportunities for multi-solving seem to be very much at the local level. And as we interview multi-solvers, what we often hear is that the silos are actually most debilitating at the highest levels of systems, where we organize ourselves into ministries and divisions and departments. But in local communities, it's often, you know, the same people are managing water and energy and education, and they see the connections. So around the world, we're seeing a trend toward developing instruments that allow both resources and decision-making power to flow down to very local levels. The biggest example I met of this in Paris was several leaders at really giant global forces like the World Bank is investing $2 billion this year in $5,000 bundles for local, in this case, villages around the world in developing countries. But it's that sort of idea of you can maybe motivate multi-solving from higher levels, but it may really ask you to give both financing and decision-making power to lower levels in communities. And I think that's a puzzle that's going to continue to be experimented with in the coming years. And I think this is my last thing to have you consider, is that as you start to make progress on implementing climate plans, I would really urge you to track the co-benefits as well as the climate progress. And to think about in setting your targets, maybe you have co-benefit targets as well as carbon targets, and to establish baselines for both and to track progress for both. I think that this is going to be particularly important as we continue that downward curve that I showed you in one of the first slides. It's going to be the rest of our lifetime and our children's lifetime, this effort to reduce every last drop of carbon out of the global economy. And motivating that based on the climate results is going to be hard, because we know that the climate changes so slowly. And in fact, no matter how hard we work, the climate's going to be getting worse because of carbon pollution that's already locked into the atmosphere. On the other hand, with co-benefits, we have the potential to show really quick and really important progress on things people care about. But if we aren't planning ahead to track that and to report what we're seeing, I think we lose that potential motivating force. So I think it's another place where I see California doing a good job. I've seen lots of case studies in the last year about the co-benefits California is harvesting. And again, I draw your attention to that report from the Green Mining Institute that looked at some case studies from those early pilot projects. And that was my whirlwind tour through some thoughts about multi-solving. And Carrie and Ben, I think you guys are going to help us with some questions for the last few minutes.
Yes. So thank you very much. That was really interesting. So we do have questions coming in, and I'll go ahead and start reading off a few. We have quite a few, so bear with me as I... Can you cite specific examples of how your research analysis has reduced political resistance to climate protection? Resistance often framed around the concerns for negative economic impacts.
Well, I can tell you about one experience from our own work, and then I think I'd point you again to California. So I mentioned briefly our work in Milwaukee, which was focused on stormwater management, really brought to mind as a response to climate resilience, as they're facing, like lots of places, increased rainfall and precipitation. And they have a very proactive department, the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District, who's quite enthusiastic about multi-solving and the benefits of green infrastructure as a way to slow down the flow of stormwater in really sort of very dense, highly paved urban watersheds. But they were running into the challenge of getting from pilot projects to scaling it up. And the reason they were running into that was we determined kind of a narrow framing around the stormwater benefit. And the project that we did brought in the public health advocates and the environmental health advocates and the economic development advocates in that watershed to start to explore scenarios where investment in green infrastructure paid off in these multiple different ways. And so it was a combination of looking at scenarios, hearing about projects, and the benefits that had rippled out of them that produced a network of people who hadn't necessarily been working together or seeing that they had a common, sort of a common objective. But the process of looking at these scenarios together managed to reframe for people in that watershed this opportunity. So that would be one example where I saw real people making the connections with each other and getting excited about it. A second report that you might look at from California also came out, I think, toward the end of last year, and it's called How California's Climate Leadership Could Change the World, and it's published by the Bioneers organization. I think it might be a report on a meeting they convened, but it's quite a extensive look into the community organizing that that led to California's climate legislation. And the message I got from those stories was the extent to which the local and immediate impacts on a diverse mix of California constituencies was a very deliberate part of their strategy that built the base of support to help that legislation come into place. So I think that is a pretty clear example where multiple benefits thinking did help address some of that resistance that the question is referring to.
Great. So another question we have is, what analysis tool do you recommend using to develop some of the health co-benefit metrics, some of the underlying tools that project out the number of lives saved or the reduced cases of asthma?
Yeah, I'm not the best person to endorse specific tools. I know there's a number of EPA tools, and I don't have the names of those at my fingertips right now. There also is some, I think I found really compelling modeling studies that come from the Center for Global Health and the Environment at Harvard, and they did some analysis on the U.S. Clean Power Plan that gave some of those metrics. So looking at the methodology in those reports to the tools that they used would be a way to find some of those.
Do you know if some of these are available for free or for local usage?
I'm sorry, I don't know for sure about that. I know some of the EPA tools are, but I don't know their level of sort of detail and resolution.
Okay, great. So what efforts are you undertaking to bring this holistic view to lawmakers to try and drive better policy decisions?
That's a great question as well. The main thing that we see our niche being, because we're a very small organization, we do have this systems view, so we're creating tools like the one that I mentioned for Milwaukee, and now we're working in the city of Atlanta with partners there in a similar approach. And we're trying to develop things like this list of 6 or 8 things to keep in mind that I ended my presentation with into ways that feel actionable for both grassroots leaders and lawmakers and decision makers. One thing that we're finding is that in contrast to climate change, where you can have a global model that provides a lot of insight with one tool, when it comes to any of these co-benefits, they are very specific and very local. And so a small organization like ours isn't going to be able to help people find the exact right solutions for their situation. And so our thinking is that we're more useful if we can point people in the right directions and then say, you're going to probably need to convene diverse groups of experts together to find out what is the magic combination of co-benefits that delivers what this community or this state or this region really needs. I also think there's a big need for people to learn from each other because there's so much experimentation happening around the world and in the United States right now. So one thing we're contemplating and hearing from people, you can see my email address here, whether you think it would be useful to bring together groups of practitioners to share with each other what they're learning and what's working and what some of the obstacles are.
Great, and actually that leads into another question. Can you provide reference for how other groups have designed stakeholder engagement to invite diverse perspectives?
One thing that we are doing in our website, so you see it up there, climateinteractive.org, we have a section on multi-solving, and within that we have a section called Multi-Solving Examples. And what we're doing there is just trying to spur people's imagination about what's possible. So you'll find stories from around the world of really intriguing multi-solving approaches, and about a quarter of the examples are focused on specific organizations. And so you can see a sort of thumbnail paragraph sketch of ideas and organizations, and then links that lead you deeper into their work. So that would be a starting place, and an ambition we have for this year is to collate that into more of a kind of at-a-glance reference for people. So hearing that that's interesting to at least one person on that call, this call, is good encouragement to take that further. But for now, you can peruse our library of examples.
So a couple of questions on resources. So folks are wondering if your slides are available online, or if we can post them so they could utilize some of the information you presented for presentations they're doing. And then just some of the reports that you cited, do you have those on your website?
Great. Well, our slides, these slides aren't posted yet, but we'll do that sometime this week. And if the hosts of the webinar want to post them as well, I'll make sure you guys get them and you can do that. I think there's also a recording of this webinar, I understand.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. You'll find that we did our best to put the reference for each example that we used on the slide. So once you get the slides, that should take you to those sources. And before we post them, we'll double check to make sure we've done that.
And some of the California reports that you referenced, are those on your website?
Those are pretty new, and they probably aren't on our website, but we'll make sure there's one more slide in this deck that references those, because they're really great resources. Great,
thank you. Okay, well with that, I think we're done with the questions, and appreciate your partaking in our webinar series, and I think we'll have some really good dialogue that comes out of this.
Great, thanks so much for having me.
Sure. So we will be posting this recording on our website. So for those of you who know others who missed it, feel free to pass on the link, and we'll get the presentation up as well to use as a resource. We're still lining up additional webinars for the remaining year. We'll likely have one a month, possibly two on some months. So stay tuned, and we'll be sending out invitations to upcoming webinars. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.